In the middle of Wisconsin, there was a small, quiet town called Plainfield. Everyone knew everyone. People left their doors unlocked, children played on the dusty roads, and life seemed calm, almost too calm. But behind that peace, something dark was growing, something that would soon shock the entire nation. This is the story of Ed Gein, a man who looked harmless, quiet, even friendly. But inside his mind, something was deeply broken. What the world later found in his farmhouse would become one of the most disturbing discoveries in American history. It all began with the disappearance of a woman named Bernice Worden. It was a cold November morning in 1957. Snow covered the small town and most people stayed inside their homes. Bernice Worden owned a small hardware store in the center of town. She was well known, respected, and kind to everyone. That morning, her son, Frank Worden, couldn't reach her. The store was closed early, which was strange. He decided to check inside. When he entered, the cash register was open. There were traces of blood on the floor leading out the back door. Bernice was gone. Frank knew something terrible had happened. He immediately called the police. When officers arrived, they searched for clues. The last sale written in Bernice's receipt book was for antifreeze, and it had one name written beside it, Ed Gein. Police officers knew Ed. Everyone in Plainfield did. He was that shy, strange man who lived alone on his family farm after his parents died. People said he was quiet, polite, and never caused trouble. But they also said there was something off about him. When officers reached Ed's farm, they didn't expect much. They thought maybe he had taken Bernice by mistake, or maybe knew something about her disappearance. But what they found inside that farmhouse was beyond imagination. It was already dark when the police entered the house. The air smelled rotten and heavy. Their flashlights cut through the dust and cobwebs. The rooms were messy, piles of junk, old newspapers, and broken furniture. Then, in a small shed behind the house, an officer saw something hanging from the ceiling. At first, he thought it was a deer. But as he moved closer, his blood froze. It wasn't a deer. It was the body of Bernice Worden, hanging upside down, cut open like a hunting animal. The officers were in shock. No one spoke for a few seconds. Then, as they searched more, the nightmare grew worse. Inside the house, they found things that didn't seem real. Bowls made from human skulls, lampshades made from human skin, chairs covered in flesh, and masks made from faces. Everything they touched revealed another horror. It was a house of death, a place no one could have imagined existed in their small, peaceful town. To understand how this man became a monster, we need to go back to his childhood. Ed was born in 1906. His father, George, was an alcoholic who rarely worked. His mother, Augusta Gein, was a strict religious woman who believed the world was full of sinners. She taught Ed and his brother that women, except her, were evil and would lead men to sin. Augusta controlled every part of Ed's life. She didn't let him make friends. She forced him to read the Bible every night and warned him about the dangers of the outside world. Ed believed every word she said. To him, his mother was perfect, pure, almost like a god. When his father died and later his brother died in a mysterious fire, only Ed and his mother were left. He took care of her, obeyed her, and lived for her. But in 1945, Augusta died after a stroke. And when she was gone, Ed was completely alone. That's when the darkness took over. After his mother's death, Ed shut himself away in the farmhouse. He closed off all the rooms his mother had used and left them untouched, like a museum of memories. He lived in one small part of the house, surrounded by filth, junk, and silence. But in that silence, his obsession grew. He started visiting local graveyards at night. At first, he said he only wanted to feel close to his mother again. But soon, his desires turned darker. He began digging up graves, taking body parts home, and using them to rebuild what he had lost. He created masks of faces and suits made from skin, trying to bring his mother back in a twisted, horrifying way. When he couldn't find enough from the graves, he started looking for living victims. That's when women began disappearing. Back at the police station, Ed Gein sat quietly. He didn't resist arrest. He didn't even seem surprised. When officers asked him about Bernice Warden, he simply nodded and said, "She's in the shed." Then, without emotion, he described everything, how he killed her, how he skinned bodies, and how he used their remains. He spoke as if it was normal, as if he didn't understand the horror of what he had done. Investigators listened in disbelief. It was clear that Ed Gein wasn't just a killer, he was something far worse, a man who lived in a world of death, fantasy, and madness. News spread fast. Plainfield became the center of national attention. Reporters, police, and psychologists all rushed to see the man the papers called the Mad Butcher of Plainfield. Neighbors who once waved to Ed now refused to even say his name. They couldn't believe that the quiet man who helped with chores, who fixed things for people, was the same person who created furniture from human remains. It was like a horror movie, but this was real life. The crimes of Ed Gein didn't just shock America, they changed it. His story inspired some of the most famous horror movies ever made: Psycho, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and The Silence of the Lambs. But before the world saw him as a movie monster, he was a real man, living alone on a broken farm, lost between love, loneliness, and madness. And this was only the beginning. Because what police discovered later about his grave robberies, his strange experiments, and his obsession with becoming his mother was even more terrifying. After the shocking discovery at the Gein farmhouse, police officers could hardly believe what they had seen. The images from that night haunted them for years. Every corner of that house told a story of pain and madness. The place was cold, dark, and silent, yet it felt alive with the presence of death. Nothing in Plainfield would ever be the same again. Ed Gein was taken to the police station for questioning. He didn't fight back. He didn't scream or cry or even try to deny it. He sat quietly, his face calm and almost innocent, like a man who had done nothing wrong. But behind that calm expression was a mind filled with horrors that no one could understand. When the officers began to question him, Ed answered every question in a simple, matter-of-fact way. He told them where he had found the bodies, how he had dug them up, and what he had done afterward. He spoke with no fear, no guilt, and no emotion. It was as if he didn't even know what he was saying was wrong. The investigators were stunned. They had heard of killers before, but nothing like this. Ed Gein wasn't killing for revenge or money or pleasure. He was doing it for something else, something far stranger. He was trying to fill the emptiness left by his mother's death. When his mother, Augusta, passed away, something inside Ed broke forever. She was his only friend, his teacher, his guide, his world. Without her, he was lost. He couldn't accept that she was gone. In his twisted mind, he believed he could somehow bring her back. Ed began reading about anatomy, death rituals, and grave robbing. He studied books about the human body, and late at night he visited graveyards. At first, he said he just wanted to see the bodies. But soon, that wasn't enough. He started digging them up. He carefully chose graves of middle-aged women who reminded him of his mother. He would take parts of their bodies, faces, skin, bones, and use them to create what he called a woman suit. When investigators heard this, they were speechless. Ed had actually tried to make a skin suit so he could become his mother. He believed that if he wore her skin, he could feel close to her again. It was his way of escaping reality, of living in the fantasy world he had created inside his mind. Psychologists were called in to study him. They wanted to understand what kind of person could do something so terrible. What they found was even more disturbing. Ed Gein was not insane in the usual way. He wasn't violent or angry. He was quiet, polite, and strangely gentle. But his mind was trapped between fantasy and reality. He told doctors that he often heard voices, sometimes his mother's voice, telling him what to do. He said that when he went to the graveyards, he wasn't himself. He said he felt like someone was guiding him, almost like a dream. When he woke up, the acts were already done. It was as if he had lived two lives, one innocent, one horrifying. As the investigation continued, police found more terrifying things in his house. There were boxes full of bones, a belt made of human nipples, a collection of skulls, and even a heart inside a paper bag. But what shocked everyone the most was that Ed had kept all of these things as if they were normal household objects. To him, they were just part of his everyday life. Reporters from across the country came to Plainfield. Newspapers printed every small detail about the case. Some people refused to believe it was true, while others were fascinated by the horror. The small town that once felt safe became a symbol of fear. People started locking their doors, afraid of what might be hiding in their neighbor's house. When Ed was finally brought to trial, he showed no emotion. He listened calmly as the charges were read: murder, grave robbing, and mutilation of bodies. When the judge asked if he understood, he simply nodded. But the court soon realized that Ed wasn't mentally fit to face a normal trial. The doctors said he suffered from severe mental illness, possibly schizophrenia, and that he could not understand right from wrong. He was sent to a mental hospital instead of prison. There, Ed lived the rest of his life quietly. Nurses said he was polite and calm, just like he had been in Plainfield. He never caused trouble. He liked reading magazines and watching TV, especially shows about police and crime. It was as if he couldn't see the irony of watching stories just like his own. Inside his mind, Ed Gein was still trapped in the same fantasy, still the lonely man who couldn't let go of his mother. He never tried to escape, never tried to deny what he had done. When people asked him why, he would sometimes smile softly and say, "I just wanted her back." Years later, even after his death, the story of Ed Gein continued to haunt America. His crimes became the inspiration for some of the most famous horror characters ever created: Norman Bates in Psycho, Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs. Each one reflected a piece of Ed's madness, his loneliness, and his obsession with skin and identity. For psychologists, Ed Gein became a case study, a window into the darkest parts of the human mind. For the media, he became a legend, a real-life nightmare that blurred the line between man and monster. But for the people of Plainfield, he was a reminder that evil doesn't always look dangerous. Sometimes, it hides behind a quiet smile. As the years passed, Ed's farmhouse was burned to the ground by an unknown person. Some said it was an accident. Others believed the townspeople wanted to erase every trace of that horror. But even though the house was gone, the story remained. People still drove by the empty land, whispering about the man who once lived there, the man who turned his grief into madness. Ed Gein died in 1984 at a mental hospital. He was buried next to his mother in the same cemetery where many of his victims once rested. Even in death, he was close to her, just as he always wanted. But his story never truly ended. His name still echoes through time as one of the most disturbing criminals in history, the real-life psycho who changed the way the world looked at horror forever. Even after Ed Gein's death, his story refused to fade. It became more than just a crime. It became a symbol of how darkness can live behind the most ordinary faces. The quiet man from Plainfield had left a permanent scar on American history, and people wanted to understand how such evil could exist in a small, peaceful town. Reporters, filmmakers, and psychologists kept returning to the same question. What turned Ed Gein into a monster? Was he born that way? Or did his mother's control and isolation slowly twist his mind? Experts studied every detail of his childhood, every word he said during interviews, and every item found in his house. The more they looked, the clearer it became. Ed Gein was not like other killers. He wasn't driven by anger or hate. He was driven by loneliness, by obsession, and by a deep confusion between love and death. Ed's relationship with his mother was at the center of everything. She was strict, controlling, and deeply religious. She filled Ed's mind with fear, fear of women, fear of sin, and fear of the outside world. For her, everything beyond their farmhouse was evil. But she was also the only person who ever gave Ed attention or care. He grew up believing she was the only one who truly loved him. When she died, Ed couldn't accept it. He didn't know how to live without her voice, her rules, her presence. So, in his twisted mind, he found a way to bring her back. Through the bodies he stole, through the skin he wore, he tried to recreate the comfort he lost. His crimes were horrifying, but they were also tragic. A lonely man's desperate attempt to feel love again, in the only way his broken mind understood. Psychologists called it psychotic attachment. He wasn't trying to harm for pleasure, he was trying to rebuild what was gone. But his actions showed how far the human mind could fall when pain and delusion mixed together. As word of his crimes spread, the media couldn't look away. Newspapers called him the Butcher of Plainfield. Radio shows described the details of his house in chilling tones. People across America were terrified, but fascinated. It was horror that was real, not made up for the movies. Soon, Hollywood took notice. Writers and directors began using Ed Gein's story as inspiration. In 1960, Alfred Hitchcock released Psycho, the story of a lonely man who loved his mother too much and couldn't let her go. The character of Norman Bates was directly inspired by Ed. Later, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre showed a family of killers who wore human skin masks, another reflection of Ed's crimes. The Silence of the Lambs introduced Buffalo Bill, a man who wanted to make a suit from skin. Again, the shadow of Ed Gein. Each of these films terrified millions. But what made them truly frightening wasn't just the violence. It was the idea that such horror came from a real person, a man who looked harmless, a man who lived among normal people, yet kept unimaginable secrets behind his doors. The name Ed Gein became more than a name. It became a legend. People whispered about his ghost haunting the old farmland. Tourists came from far away just to see the empty field where his house once stood. Some even stole pieces of his gravestone as souvenirs. Everyone wanted to see a piece of the story that had changed America. Ed's idea of horror forever. But behind all the fear and fascination was a sad truth. Ed Gein's story was not just about murder. It was about mental illness left untreated, about isolation, and about the dangers of living too long inside your own mind. He was a man trapped between love and obsession, sanity and madness. For the doctors who studied him, Ed's case became a warning. They saw how childhood trauma and emotional abuse could twist a person beyond repair. They wrote books, gave lectures, and used Ed's life to teach future generations about the importance of mental health and early treatment. For the people of Plainfield, the story was something they wanted to forget. They didn't want their town's name to be linked to such evil. Many families stopped talking about it altogether. They wanted peace again, but the shadow of Ed Gein still hung over them. Every time a new movie came out inspired by him, that wound opened again. Even decades later, people who had known Ed remembered him not as a monster, but as that quiet man who helped around town, who fixed fences, and who smiled shyly when people spoke to him. That was the most disturbing part. Evil, they realized, doesn't always look dangerous. Sometimes it hides behind kindness. When Ed died in 1984, his story could have ended there. But the truth is, it never did. The fear he created became part of American culture. His crimes changed how people thought about killers. Before him, most thought murderers were wild, violent, and obvious. After Ed, people learned that the most terrifying monsters could look completely normal. His grave still lies in the Plainfield Cemetery, near the same graves he once disturbed. Some say his spirit still lingers, trapped in the same darkness that ruled his life. Others say it's not his spirit that haunts people. It's the story itself. The idea that someone so ordinary could commit such extraordinary horror. The legend of Ed Gein still echoes through time. Every horror movie, every ghost story, every tale of madness owes a small part to him. He was the real psycho, the man who blurred the line between the living and the dead, between love and fear, between human and monster. And though his farmhouse has turned to ashes and his body rests in the ground, the name Ed Gein still sends chills through anyone who hears it. Because sometimes the scariest stories aren't fiction. They're true. Years passed, but the story of Ed Gein refused to rest. Every time someone mentioned his name, people felt a chill down their spine. It wasn't just because of what he did. It was because of what he represented. He showed the world that real horror doesn't live in dark forests or haunted houses. It lives in the human mind. Even decades later, investigators, doctors, and filmmakers kept studying him. They wanted to know why a man like Ed, who once helped neighbors and smiled kindly at children, could turn into something so terrifying. The answer was never simple. Some said he was born broken. Others believed life and loneliness turned him into a monster. But everyone agreed on one thing. Ed Gein changed the way the world saw evil. Before his case, people believed killers were obvious, loud, angry, violent. But Ed was quiet. He blended in. He lived like everyone else, hiding his madness behind a normal face. That's what made him unforgettable. He wasn't the monster hiding in the woods. He was the one living next door. Hollywood continued to keep his story alive. Every few years, a new movie, documentary, or book appeared, exploring his crimes from a different angle. But even with all that attention, no one could truly understand him. He was like a puzzle with missing pieces, a man trapped inside his own broken thoughts. For psychologists, Ed Gein became a dark lesson. His case was used in classrooms and studies to show what happens when trauma and mental illness are ignored. They said his isolation, his grief, and his mother's control all built the path that led him to horror. It was a warning that no one should ever live completely alone with their pain. For filmmakers, Ed Gein became the face of fear. His story shaped the entire horror genre. The quiet man who loses his mind because of love and loneliness became the blueprint for 1,000 killers on screen. But no matter how many times the story was told, the real Ed Gein remained scarier than any movie character, because he was real. People who lived in Plainfield still remember the fear. Some still refuse to talk about it. To them, Ed's name is like a curse, a shadow that still lingers over their small town. Tourists sometimes drive by the empty field where his farmhouse once stood, just to imagine what it must have looked like. But nothing grows easily there anymore. The land feels empty, haunted, almost as if it remembers. After Ed's death in 1984, his grave became a strange attraction. People came from all over the country just to see it. Some left flowers, others stole small pieces of the headstone until it had to be removed completely. Even in death, Ed Gein drew curiosity. People couldn't stop wondering, how could someone so quiet hide something so dark? Over time, his story became more than a crime. It became a mirror, a reflection of the human mind's deepest fears. Fear of loneliness, fear of losing someone we love, and fear of what happens when that love turns into madness. The more people learned about Ed, the more they realized his story wasn't just about murder. It was about obsession, grief, and the line between sanity and insanity. He didn't just kill people. He killed the idea that evil always looks evil. Today, when people watch movies like Psycho or The Silence of the Lambs, they often forget that somewhere behind those characters was a real man who once walked among ordinary people. A man who sat quietly in his kitchen while unspeakable things lay hidden just a few feet away. In the end, Ed Gein became something larger than himself. He became a symbol of how fragile the human mind can be, and how easily reality can break when pain takes control. His crimes forced people to look at mental illness differently, to understand that sometimes monsters are made, not born. Even now, when the wind blows through the empty fields of Plainfield, it feels like the land itself whispers his name, not to honor him, but to warn others. To remind everyone that sometimes the scariest monsters are not in stories or nightmares. They are real. They are human. And as the camera fades to black, one truth remains. Ed Gein was not just the real psycho. He was the man who showed the world that horror lives not in shadows, but inside the mind of man.